we tend to look at kids who are acting out and maybe attribute it to bad parenting, and there could be some parenting effects in there, but very often that's the way they're wired.
We
And we can change that. My life mission is to educate people about what these skills are and how important they are.
we've all seen that student, the one who is bright and capable but can't seem to get started, can't stay organized or manage their impulses. And for years, we thought that these challenges were just a result of laziness or bad behavior. But our guest today has spent her career proving that they are actually brain based skill deficits that can be taught. She's a past president of both the National and the International Psychology Associations and the co author of the legendary Smart But Scattered series. Please join me for a deep dive into executive functioning with the legendary Dr. Peg Dawson. All right, Dr. Dawson, thank you so much for being here. It is an absolute pleasure to have you on the show. The work that you have done around executive functioning has been so transformative for myself and my own practice. But executive function isn't something that's ubiquitously known across the field and all educators. It's definitely getting more popular. But for someone who doesn't know anything about executive function and the work you've done, just fill us in with what it is and why it matters.
Okay, so the way I describe executive skills, that they are brain-based skills that are managed out of the frontal lobes of the brain. And the reason we call them executive skills is because they're the skills required to execute tasks. That's where the name came from. So there's skills like planning, organization, time management, task initiation, emotional control. What
Right.
they have in common, in addition to being um, managed out of the frontal lobes of the brain, is that they're the skills we need to get things done, which was a definition that I taught a summer class at the University of Southern Maine for several years. And a second grade teacher in one of my classes was trying to figure out, how do I explain executive skills to second graders? And that's what she came up with. They're the skills you need to get things done. I sometimes call them the hidden curriculum, because they're the skills that kids absolutely need to be successful in school, and yet you won't find them in any local, state, or national curriculum standards. So that's my life mission, is to educate people about what these skills are and how important they are for basically school performance, and for obviously adults need executive skills as well, so it doesn't stop when kids finish whatever their schooling is.
Yeah, and of the 11 skills, the taxonomy that you really created, tell me, is there any one that's most often misidentified? Maybe it's attributed to, the environment or to the parents or to just a character flaw in the child themselves, but is really an executive skill deficit.
Yeah, I think that there are two in particular that come to mind, and that because we tend to just see them as behavior or misbehavior. So response inhibition, which is the ability to manage your impulses, or self-control, and then the other one's emotional control. And people are born with different strengths, and there, I mean, there, it's really genetics and environment, so you can't just blame genetics on it. But I do think that we tend to look at kids who are acting out and maybe attribute it to bad parenting, and there could be some parenting effects in there. But very often that's the way they're wired.
We
And we can change that, but it helps to come at it from a point of view of, these are skills that can be taught. These are not things that we blame kids for, but we try to help them develop those skills so that they're more effective, better adjusted, and happier, basically.
Yeah, and what's the cost if you misdiagnose, so to speak? If someone has, a child has an issue with emotional control and you attribute it to, they just won't calm down. They just want to be misbehaving. They could do better, but they just aren't. Uh, what's
Right.
what's the cost of misidentifying that?
Well, the cost is what that's communicating to the child, because
Mhm.
then the child starts believing they're a bad person, or they start absorbing the messages they're getting and assume that's the way they are. And then in order to change that, you have to undo that down the road.
Mhm.
And I see the same thing, although it's coming at it from a different angle. I see the same thing with kids with attention disorders, even if they're not struggling with response inhibition. If they're having trouble focusing and paying attention and getting started on work and finishing work, then they start being described as lazy. And then they start thinking of themselves as lazy.
Right.
And eventually that becomes both part of who they are, but it also becomes a convenient excuse for like not doing homework, for instance. I basically remember testing a 15-year-old whose father fairly on a regular basis told him, uh, you're so lazy, you could never get into MIT, which is where the father went. The student was smart enough to get into MIT, but he basically just assumed, well, I'm just lazy.
Mhm.
I asked him at one point, why are you having such trouble with homework? And he said, yeah, well, I'm just lazy. That's what my father tells me.
Yeah.
And so then you have to combat that. And it really does get woven into the fabric of who you are after a while. So I think that whatever labels we're applying to kids that are pejorative or not positive, kids eventually absorb that and that's who they start believing they are.
Yeah, and I think
So,
people get into education because of that gift that we have to transform lives. And I think oftentimes we might forget what a true responsibility it is that, with great power comes great responsibility, that we can also shape students in a way that damages them in the future if we're not really careful about how we approach that for those kiddos. I've always
right.
approached it from the lens of skill versus will, and you always assume skill first because the cost is nominal or nothing. Um, but if you assume that it's will and you're wrong and there's really a skill deficit, then you can do some real damage to a kid down the line.
Yeah, that's exactly the same tack that I take. Is it a skill deficit or is it a motivational deficit? And I always assume it's a skill deficit because you can help kids develop those skills.
Yeah.
So yeah, I agree with you completely on that.
Yeah. And I think it
Yeah.
also puts educators in a more like empowering place if we really believe that we can control our little sphere of influence and we can really enhance how kids are performing and how they're doing it. It just is a more empowering place to lead from and teach from. So I think it's
Hmm.
a great message that you share with the world. You
Yeah.
spoke about the 15-year-old. Is there any other student that really stands out over the course of your illustrious career that really just like sticks with you?
Well, it's funny when I first saw that, and you sent me a set of questions in advance to think about. When I first saw that question, I thought, gee, I don't think that's true. I think I'm going to ask him to strike that question. And then I realized, yeah, my son.
Oh, tell me about that.
So did he was diagnosed with ADHD when he was in middle school. And looking back, I like for instance his fourth grade teacher, who was also his sixth grade teacher. I remember being in a parent interview when Aaron was in sixth grade, and the teacher said, the entire year Aaron was in fourth grade, I don't think he sat down once. He would rest one knee on the chair and lean over his desk, and that's how he did his work. And
Sure.
so it took me a while because he was not the hyperactive, impulsive kind of ADD kid. He was the distractible, daydreamy, unfocused, forgetful kind of kid. And so, once we diagnosed his attention disorder, then we started. I mean, basically, what I did was, when he was in eighth grade, I basically said, "What do I want this kid to look like when he graduates from high school?" And then I reverse engineered it. I
Right.
basically said, so I decided to focus on two things. I focused on him doing his homework as best I could manage that and handing it in on time because I thought that translated into adult job responsibilities. That's getting a job and meeting or doing what the job requires and meeting deadlines. And so we worked through high school and, every day when he came from school, I said, what do you have to do? When are you going to do it? And we made plans. So we basically tackled his executive skills through those kinds of processes. And it was only when he was in his mid 20s that I realized which of the strategies we'd used were most effective, in part because he told me, yeah. Mom, it wasn't until I was 25 that I stopped going through this mental homework checklist at the end of every day.
Yeah.
And he graduated from college at age 22 and didn't start graduate school until age 26. So there was 3 years in there where that mental homework checklist was useless to him, which is why he was irritated. But I'm listening to him. I'm thinking, yes, because that told me that was the strategy that worked with him. And even now, I mean, he's in his mid 40s. And he still talks about how those skills and strategies benefited from him. And the other reason I selected him was because when you're the parent of one of these kids is you get the longitudinal perspective. If a kid is in my office, I see him once. I mean, I've seen a few kids. I remember seeing one who was 7, and then his mother came back when he was a freshman in high school because she'd managed to shepherd him through elementary and middle school, and then he sort of fell apart in high school. So maybe I saw kids a couple of times, but with my son, I saw him day in and day out, and I saw him into adulthood, and I saw how he's raising his own kids, and so that's the one that sticks out in my mind.
Yeah, what a
Mhm.
fascinating
Yeah.
intersection. And tell me how that aligned with like your career and the work that you did. Was it was that the spark that made you really interested in this, or did it just happen to intersect in a way that you could really help your son at a time that he really needed you as that advocate?
Yeah, I think it was almost serendipitous. I left working in the public schools and started working in a clinic setting, and the kids that were getting referred to me, and I was doing mostly evaluations, similar to what I'd done as a school psychologist. The most of the kids being referred to me were kids with learning disabilities or difficulties or attention disorders. And so it was actually as I developed that expertise in ADHD, that preceded me beginning to see it in my son. Because as I say, he wasn't some kids with ADHD, you know them from the day they walk through the kindergarten door. My son was not one of those,
Mhm.
and so it was really my profession enabled me to pick up on things in my son that I might have missed otherwise.
Yeah.
And then they sort of fed each other. That oh, let's see what works. Maybe I can learn something about this.
Yeah, and what was
Um,
the landscape like maybe back when he was, in elementary school? Was it as inclusive and understanding as was now, or did you really have to fight for him to be able to stand up all class? Was that something that you really had to be a parent and advocate on his behalf?
so again, it, his problems were not so significant that he required accommodations. I would have fought for them if he'd needed them. But I remember, I mean, we did try medication, and that's the landscape that has changed. The medication that was available would have been the early to mid 90s. The medications that were available then are nowhere near as good as they are now, both in terms of effectiveness in treating attention disorders, but also minimizing unpleasant side effects. And that was basically what affected my son was unpleasant side effects. And because he was, I knew he could have been an AB student. He was a BC student. I thought I can live with that. He can live with that. And I thought there was some value for him to learn how to navigate the world without me. And this is and I when I meet with parents, this is a choice every parent has to make on their own. Am I going to intervene so that my kid can be the A student I know he can be, or am I going to let things unfold so that he can learn how to navigate the real world? And had he been a CD student and I'd really started seeing a negative effect on how he felt about himself and everything else, I would have intervened faster. But he learned a lot of lessons from the way we handled it. But every
Yeah.
kid is different.
A lot of your research and commentary speaks on that your own practice, where it's some parents who are over involved and that has some real downside, and parents who are under involved and that has its own set of downsides. Of really trying to zero it in right. Is one side more or less dangerous, or one more or less common, and how do you navigate that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I would say so it depends on like with middle class communities, which are that was the population I was serving. There's a greater tendency to be over involved. And I understand why that is because you want your kid to be happy and you want your kid to not experience maybe some of the pain you experienced when you were growing up. And so what you tend to do is to maybe jump in too quickly, maybe contact the teacher and let them know that um, that something bad happened, which if you left it on your own, your kid and whoever the bad thing happened, maybe they could work it out on their own. But it's an art as much as it is a science to figure out when do I intervene and when do I step back and let my child learn life lessons. And I probably erred too much on the side of intervening. I think if I were going to go back and redo it, there would have been more times where I would have stood back and said, "So, Aaron, how do you think you can handle this?" Which is, I think that's one of the ways for over-involved parents, or if they're doing too much, just stop and say, what do you think? How do you think you can handle this? Um, and see if they can come up. There's a great book called Raising. What is it called? Raising Baby or something like that. It was written by an American who raised a child in France, and she was talking about how French parenting is different from American parenting. And one of the lessons she learned was never do for your kids something they can do for themselves. And I think, again, that would be something where if I were going to go back and redo, I would be thinking about, my kid can clean his own bedroom. He may need a little supervision here, but he can do that. Or he can clear his dirty dishes out of the living room. Not that I overdid that, but I think we tend to do that. We tend to smooth the way. That whole description of helicopter parents or snowplow parents is those are parents who are trying to smooth the way. And again, nobody likes to see their kid unhappy. I mean, some of my most poignant memories with both my kids. I have two sons, and only one had an attention disorder. They both struggled in school for different reasons. But the times I remember is when they were really hurt by something, and it might have been something they could have solved on their own. So, but it's hard not to jump in.
Yeah. As a parent, I have 2 young kids myself. I struggle in the same way. It's you don't want your kids to ever suffer, especially in a way that you might have yourself, because I know you talk about the apple not falling so far from the tree sometimes, and
Yeah,
sometimes parents had those negative experiences, and so I think unintentionally they project onto their children and they try and rescue them from
yeah,
experiences that are hard, but also good for their growth.
yeah.
So tell me, do you think in today's landscape we are, um, without meaning to, missing some students who really have some of these executive skill deficits because when we're looking at them, we're not really triangulating the data. We're just relying on, kind of clinical observations, which, as you talk about, it kind of scaffolds out uh, being able to really see some of the skills they need. So, like a one-on-one setting, a calm setting, a quiet setting where the tasks are repeated to the child as you're assessing for the exact thing you're trying to assess for. Do you see that oftentimes we scaffold ourselves out of identifying and really supporting these kiddos?
Yeah, and if you're getting at how do we pick them up in a testing situation, uh, one of the things that as I developed my own assessment skills and strategies, I realized that I needed to collect information from a variety of sources. If I only relied on how the kid was in my office, I was going to miss some stuff. So parent checklists, parent interviews, teacher checklists. I was working in a clinic setting, so teacher interviews were not as easy. But I would try to pull at least all those sources of information together. And then the other thing that I developed over time was an ability to see executive skill challenges in a testing situation. It wouldn't necessarily show up on a subtest score, but for instance, a kid who answers the question you're asking before you finished asking it, or the kid who reaches for materials as soon as you set them out, even though you said, wait until I tell you what to do. That's response inhibition. And so you start picking up or the kid who, um, listens to a question and only answers part of it because he can only remember part of the question. So you learn to look for those signs. And that to me was so in a sense, the testing I did was a structured clinical observation. So I'm looking at the child's behavior and in part, I start with a parent interview. So I get to know the parent knows their kid better than anybody else ever will. So they gave me information. And then I start looking to see, am I going to see that in the testing situation? But by the way, I always had when I was a school psychologist and would go into classrooms to observe, I had the same issue there because I would go in and I could any number of times that I'm leaving the classroom and the teacher's saying, "I can't believe you didn't see the behavior I wanted you to see."
Right.
And then it took me the longest time to realize, Oh, yeah, of course, the kid changed his behavior because I was there. I was a stranger in the class, even though I sat way over to the side and only looked at them out of the corner of my eye. I'm a stranger in that classroom. And I often use the analogy of if you it would be like inviting a stranger into Sunday dinner at your house. Your behavior would change.
Yes.
And everybody, the kids' behaviors would change. And so I often said when I was giving advice to school psychologists, if you really want to see the behavior teachers are concerned about, observe the kid for an hour, but 10 minutes a day for 6 days. And by day 6, the kid may have acclimated to you being in the classroom, and their true colors come out. So,
Yeah.
but I think to get at the broader part of your question, the main thing is taking in sources of information from multiple different angles, so that you're not relying just on test scores or just on what the parent is saying or just teacher checklists. You want to put it all together and look for commonalities. And where you don't get commonalities, see if you can come up with an explanation for that.
Yeah, I'm
So,
thinking, kind of as like a school leadership lens, how important is it to have strong universals in place before you go into diagnosing individual students with individual specific deficits? How important is it to start with the universals, or does it make a difference, or is it a both and?
it's probably a both and because you certainly don't want. I mean, a kid with true executive skill challenges, even if you put in great like tier one support, so you in the regular classroom you built in the universals, those kids are probably going to struggle anyway. But if you have those in place, what you're going to meet the needs of kids who, under other circumstances, would end up getting referred for an evaluation. So it's sort of weeding out which are the kids who just need just need a little scaffolding or a little guidance compared to the kids who, yeah, they're going to need more than that. Um, so yeah, ideally, I mean, and again, I've watched my own career evolve and the things that I really advocate for. And when I first started out, I was really focusing on special ed and what we needed to do with kids in special ed. And
Right.
finally, these special ed teachers kept saying to me, you really need to talk to regular ed teachers. They really need this information too. And that's where I made the pivot. And since then, more of my work now is done in with whole schools and with general education classrooms as opposed to just focusing on kids in special ed.
Yeah. And how much do you see just being in schools? I see myself, there seems to be a trend of increasingly missing some of these foundational skills, and that's what we hear from parents as well. Do you think it's just a matter of us knowing better and having better identification tools and having the language and a mindset shift in order to identify it? Or how much do you think it is, environmental and related to parents with constantly having cell phones in their hands and not paying attention to their kiddos and kids with tablets at such an early age? How much do you think those things correlate? How would you attribute it to each?
Yeah, I mean, it's really hard to deny that technology has had a huge impact and not necessarily always a negative impact. And we tend to focus
Sure.
on that. But, I have got 3 grandchildren and I can see the things they can do. And some of the problem solving they're able to, like one of my grandsons is totally into Minecraft and he's 11 now. He's already learned how to program and how to create little video games. So there's a huge benefit of that. But I also see, and his parents have seen, when he spends too much time on his tablet, his behavior becomes problematic. In fact, he lives in Japan. He goes to an international school, and his teacher emailed my son and his wife a few weeks ago and said, "Kenchi's really kind of his behavior's a little off. He's not being nice to other kids, and this is the nicest kid in the world." And so June and my son Isaac said, "Okay, we got to limit. We got to limit screen time." So they cut him back to an hour a day. And within the week, the teacher didn't know what they were doing. She emailed them and said, "I don't know what you've done, but he's a whole lot better." So
Wow.
talk about a dramatic effect, both positive and negative. If you put kids on screens too much, the negative behavior arises. But the good news is you decrease the screen time and behavior improves.
Yeah, good.
So, but yeah, and the other piece that I think you're talking about, which is also a concern, is parents being on screens and on phones all the time. My
Yeah.
son with ADD just told me about a piece of technology called Brick. I don't know if you've heard of it.
I have, sure. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So, they're about to give their oldest daughter, who is she's finishing 7th grade, she's about to get a cell phone for her birthday, and my son has realized he has to model self-control. So he bought that, and he started with himself. He's limiting how much time he's on his phone. And he intends to add his daughter to it too once she gets her phone. So,
Yeah, and I
um,
think part of what that brick device or any of these things do, it reminds me of James Clear's book, Atomic Habits, where it's really designing the environment
yes.
produce the outcome that you're looking for. So you have that brick device and now your phone just isn't accessible. Or I
Right.
want to learn guitar. I'm going to have the guitar in my living room. Or I want to start running more. I'm going to have my shoes laid out at the front door. How much is that an impactful tool you found in developing these skills?
Yeah, and I like Atomic Habits for that reason. And other people, there's another book called Good Habits, Bad Habits, which I really like, where the author talks about how if you want to uh, establish good habits, you need to decrease friction. So
Mhm.
friction is anything that gets in the way of what you want to do. So that guitar in the living room, that's decreasing friction. If it was out of sight in the closet, then where is that? On the other hand, if you want to break a bad habit, then you need to increase friction, and that's what brick does. Or you're just setting up the environment to reduce the accessibility of whatever the temptation is, and carry this into executive skills. That's response inhibition. And I think that's the biggest issue around technology use is we are giving kids complete reign to engage in the most tempting, attractive device we can with it. And even if we talk to them about how you need to learn. I was in the airport. Oh, I think it was in. We were just in Japan. I'm flying home to Japan. I saw a dad trying to limit his son on his tablet, and the kid wanted to keep playing, and the dad was just getting so angry at his son. I thought, you're giving him a tool that he's powerless to resist.
I
And
know.
so every once in a while I have to bite my tongue because I want to take that dad aside. Do you realize how addictive that tool is?
I
And
know.
so there's a different way of handling it than just yelling at him and telling him to get off his tablet.
I
So
know
yeah.
if we can't even do better, how can we expect kids without these skills? Because, like you mentioned, they develop over years. I think it's until 25 in a
Yeah,
typical
yeah.
developing child do you really have these skills concretized. And so, to assume a 4-year old at an airport could do any better, it's silly. But
Yeah.
I've been in there myself. There's certainly
Yeah,
no
yeah.
joke. It's a tough place to be.
Yeah. Yeah.
Speaking of friction, like you talked about, tell me in a classroom setting or a school setting, what are some effective uses of that friction, whether putting some friction in place or taking some away that you feel like are those easy wins? Because teachers are always so overtaxed. And it's hard for them to do these, big, huge accommodations for all their kids all the time. But there's little ways you can do this, right? What would some of those be that have been most successful?
If I were going to name one, it would be just putting in place classroom routines. Because once you get a routine down, that takes the load off working memory. We're not asking kids to remember to hand in their homework, for instance, which is one of my biggest frustrations. I don't know. Every time I talk to parents, they say, "Well, he did the homework. He just didn't hand it in." And I said, "Well, did the teacher prompt him to hand it in?"
Mhm.
And so putting or getting ready, the first thing in the morning routine. Here are the 6 things you do when you come into school in the morning. You hang up your coat, you put your lunch, all the routines. And I've been in schools where teachers have listed, here are the 7 steps in the morning routine. So making it visible, making it a routine, because that again, you don't have to remember once it's a routine. The example I give is, I don't have to remind myself to brush my teeth before I go to bed at night. It's just now a routine that I just do without even thinking. So that's one thing. The other is, well, I really do recommend that teachers look at their classroom environment and look at what does the classroom environment facilitate a smoothly running day, or does it get in the way? I just read a couple of articles about um, the negative impact of having a lot of things on the walls in classrooms.
Wow.
For kids who are distracted. And I always read those with mixed feelings because I know teachers love to decorate their walls. But I remember testing a kid a few years ago whose mother said that she'd been in that kid's classroom, and it was wonderful, but it was so incredibly distracting because there were so many interesting things kids just wanted to look at. And so these studies actually showed that, yeah, if you've got too much on the walls and too much visual distractions, it has a negative impact on kids' ability to attend.
Yeah.
So
And so put on your consulting hat. So imagine you walk into a school and th- they don't have any of the language. They haven't read your book. They haven't read your articles. They might have heard of executive functioning. They might not have. Where would you start if a building principal or a school or district was like, this is something that I know matters? Where would you start in the first 90 days?
okay, so um, I mostly I want you start with the language and the concepts. And I always in the workshops that I do, I always start by having teachers assess their own executive skills.
Mm,
Because if they can realize that they have stronger and weaker skills, and over the years of doing these kinds of workshops, we have a ratings, a self-evaluation that we ask teachers to take, and every once in a while I'll collect them to look at, what are the results? What do these profiles look like? And it is much more common for adults to have out of the 11 or 12 skills, we have a 12th skill when we talk about adults. It's much more common to have them have three to five stronger skills and, 3 to 5 weaker skills, and then the rest are somewhere in the middle, than
mm,
it is to have everybody strong across the board. Once teachers recognize that they have stronger and weaker skills, then they may look at kids a little differently. The next step, and I won't say this is the first 90 days. And in fact, I think, I mean, when I think about how long it takes to fully integrate executive skills into a school, I would say it's a 3 to 5 year process.
mhm,
Because first teachers have to become familiar with what the skills are. Then they have to, and I have a workshop, 5 steps for embedding executive skills into daily classroom routines and lessons. And so first teachers have to understand what the skills are and how they impact learning. Then they have to learn to decode behavior. They have to look at kids in their classroom and say, oh, that behavior is probably problems with response inhibition. Or that behavior suggests to me that kid is really good at goal directed persistence. And I mentioned both strengths and weaknesses here because, and I make this mistake too. My training as a psychologist is looking at everything from a deficit model. And
mm.
yet, with executive skills, there is so much mileage to be gained by letting kids know what executive skill strengths they have. I
Yeah.
have this great audio recording. It's from the podcast called This American Life, where Ira Glass is interviewing a fifth grader with dyslexia, and he's talking to the kid about what it's like to have dyslexia, and he's having him read a passage, and he's really struggling with the passage. And when I play it in my workshops, I say, okay, I want you to listen for what executive skill challenges this kid has, but I also want you to listen for what his strengths are. And it's perfect for that because this kid has amazing emotional control, amazingly goal-directed persistence, and amazing sustained attention. His working memory as it applies to reading is terrible, and he's pretty inflexible when it applies to reading, not necessarily in other situations, but just to get teachers to tune in not just to the weaknesses, but also to the strengths. And then the next step, and this takes a while, is then you start giving all that information to kids. And I have a lot of schools that use posters. So they put posters up with each of the executive skills with a definition or a cartoon drawing or something like that. And once those posters are up, then teachers can start referring to them um, as the day goes along. Okay, class, I've just announced we're transitioning to this next activity, and I notice kids are being a little slow getting there. What do you think this is? I mean, do you think it's response inhibition? Do you think it's task initiation? And so then kids can start seeing it themselves, um, and then start identifying it both in themselves, both as again as things they do well and things they struggle with. And then the next step is then start strategizing. Yeah, I realize I have a hard time with homework. It's really hard for me to get started on homework. Okay, so let's talk about strategies that would make it easier for you to get started on homework because that's task initiation. Yeah. So
Yeah, and when you're sharing those 5 steps with schools, is there one that you get more buy-in for initially that just as soon as you share it, they're almost like they've been waiting for that? And is there one where it's kind of feels like friction or maybe they're not quite as bought in?
well, let me talk about that. The one that I think it takes the longest for teachers to understand the value of it is that one about giving all that information to kids. Teachers are so used to being in charge of the classroom themselves. They're so used to surveying the classroom or individual kids and saying, "Oh, I think I know what's going on with that kid. I'm going to help them with that." But then to sort of step back and say, "Wait a minute, maybe this kid has some ideas,
Yeah.
or maybe the class has some ideas." I've had some of the best conversations with kids where we pick a problem like, and I've done this with a lot of middle school kids where, one of the things I like to talk about is kids report having trouble doing homework when there are more fun things to do. And so we talk about, so what are the more fun things to do? And it always comes down to TikTok or video games or social media or technology or whatever. And then I say, okay, but I know you guys do your homework. So how do you get through it? And then kids start sharing strategies. Kids say, I won't let myself, play World of Warcraft until, I finish my math homework. And when kids start listening to each other, that is way more valuable than having an adult tell them what to do. Um, even an adult who's and I've done a lot of workshops with private schools where I come in and I know they're not gonna the expert on executive skills, they're not gonna listen to me, but they're gonna listen to that 8th grader who's in the group that I'm talking to saying, "Okay, here's what I do. Before I start my homework, I put my cell phone in the highest cupboard in my kitchen so I can't hear it, so I can't see it, and it's not easily accessible." When kids hear other kids saying that, that's way more valuable, than having me say that.
Yeah.
So,
I think you're exactly right. I think the real challenge is like you're sharing. It's we can have all this information, but how do we get kids to be equal partners in this? Some success I've found has been in purposeful play, in having students have times where they're practicing these skills, but in an authentic, fun way, and not just
yeah.
sit in an office one on one with an adult you don't really know who's just drilling you with these skills. Have you found any success with that?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, I have a whole parent presentation I do where I ask parents to remember what it was like when they were growing up and how is that different from today. And I start by talking about myself, and I'm obviously older than most of my audiences, so I talk about what it was like to grow up in the 50s and 60s, where you got home from school and you could just walk into the woods for a mile and nobody said anything, and that was perfectly understood. Or where you had kids in the neighborhood that all got together, parents were, they knew what was going on, but they weren't jumping in to solve conflicts. Kids, I mean, the imaginative play that goes on when you bring a group of kids together without screens. Um, so there's so much benefit from that kind of play. And I mean, you can talk about it afterwards, and you can talk to kids about. So I noticed you. How did you guys come up with the rules for that game? Because I noticed you made up a game. Oh, so you made a plan, and you solved disagreements. And I mean, you get a bigger bang for your buck if you reflect afterwards, but even leaving that alone, there's a lot of learning that goes on with that kind of play for sure.
And how much of it do you think needs to be scaffolded and supported by adults, and how much of it just needs to be letting kids be kids and figuring it out themselves?
Yeah, I would say 75% letting kids be kids and figure it out for themselves, and 25%, intervening when you have to. I remember when my kids were young, uh, they had a weekend soccer that was sponsored by the rec department in my town, and one of the other dads and I got in a conversation. He said, I think everybody would be better off if we just dropped our kids off and just let them play soccer rather than trying to coach them and referee them. I remember thinking, because this is like 30 years ago, and I think, that's a really interesting idea, but no, we manage everything for kids, and if we could step and figure out how to do that, I think that's the other thing. I think parents are petrified that something terrible is gonna happen to their kid, because
Yeah.
I mean, we're so connected, and especially in terms of bad stories. Anytime a kid gets abducted or whatever, the entire world knows about it, and then they start thinking, "Oh, that could happen to my kid."
Yeah.
And then they do everything they can to protect them.
Yeah,
So,
even on a smaller scale, it's like as a school, you wanna limit any kind of disruptions or misbehaviors, but those misbehaviors are learning opportunities that they're learning and reflecting and growing from. If they're always making the perfect choice and there's always an adult to coach them through it and they don't have an opportunity to make mistakes, um,
yeah.
then you're missing out on a whole lot of growth that kids could be making during a time that they need to be making it.
Yeah, absolutely.
So last question that I have for you, Dr. Dawson, is imagine this were to be the last conversation you ever had about executive functioning. What is the one message that you would want someone to really hear and learn from all the work that you've done over the years on this?
I guess I would just reiterate what I said in terms of what I think is the hardest thing when schools start bringing executive skills into the school, and that is empowering kids to to understand what those skills are, to problem solve, to strategize. I have a colleague who created what she calls a barrier strategies protocol. She calls it a BSP, but she started out as a second grade teacher. She's now on the faculty at the University of Toronto.
Mm.
But it's basically you put a T on the board and you write the problem at the top, like um, kids not understanding, not hearing directions the first time they're given. And then on the left-hand side, what are the strategies? No, what are the barriers? What gets in the way? Other kids are talking, the teacher's talking too fast. We don't have our books open. And then the next on the right-hand side of that T is so what are the strategies? And making this conversations with kids and having them analyze the problem, understand what the barriers are, and then strategize. And the sooner we can incorporate that, and I realize it's hard because again, teachers are used to being in charge in the classroom. And they're used to feeling so. I mean, it's a little ironic that I'm talking about. We need to teach these skills explicitly, but we also need to step back and give kids the opportunity to discover what their own inner strengths are, they understand themselves, and then and then collaborate with each other to identify classroom problems, to solve classroom problems. So that would be the piece that I would be hoping. And it's not just executive skills. It's really how do we empower kids to feel more in charge. There's a concept called mattering, which I don't know if you're familiar with that term, but the research really shows that when someone feels like they matter, that what they do matters, then they are much more invested in it. That's why I love going into classrooms and talking to the kids about. So, what's the solution for that? And suddenly, the kid feels like they matter because their ideas may actually get implemented. So
Yeah,
that's where I
wonderful.
would leave it.
Dr. Dawson, thank you so much for the work that you have done, the language that you've given to educators and to parents. It's been transformative, and I'm so grateful myself for what you've given to the educational world, and as a parent for what you've given to me as a parent. So thank you for all the work that you've done over the years, and thank you for the conversation.
Yeah, sure, and absolutely, and thank you a school administrator for understanding this stuff and to embrace it because it's really, really important.